You are not disturbed by life, but by your refusal to govern your own mind. You keep reacting to events without examining your judgment, and that is why nothing feels steady. Everything you feel as suffering comes from confusing what is yours to control with what never was. Your thoughts, your choices, and your actions belong to you. Everything else does not. Until you live by this distinction, your mind will stay unsettled no matter what changes outside you. In this video, you will learn how to stop letting impressions rule you and how to return again and again to reason as your guide, not as theory, but as daily discipline in ordinary moments when you are pressured, tired, or uncertain. If you want to keep walking this path of Stoic practice, subscribe and stay here with us. This is not motivation. It is training in how to think and live with clarity when life does not cooperate. Number 1. Distinguish what controls you from what never can. You wake each morning already defeated because you hand your peace to things that were never yours to command. One careless word from another person changes your mood. One delay ruins your patience. One rejection poisons your confidence. One moment of discomfort makes you abandon your principles. Then you ask why your mind feels weak. You ask why anxiety follows you everywhere. You ask why you cannot remain steady when life becomes difficult. The answer is simple and hard at the same time. You are trying to control what was never placed under your authority while neglecting the only thing that truly belongs to you. Your mind has become a servant to events. Look honestly at your life. How much of your suffering comes from reality itself, and how much comes from your demand that reality obey you? You demand that people speak the way you prefer. You demand that the world move according to your timing. You demand that outcomes unfold according to your plans. You demand certainty where none exists. Then when life refuses your demands, you call yourself unlucky or wounded or betrayed. But life did not betray you. You betrayed yourself the moment you believed your peace depended on what you cannot command. Nothing outside your own reasoned choice belongs to you. Not your reputation, not your wealth, not your body, not your position, not the opinions of others, not the loyalty of friends, not even the length of your own life. All of these stand outside your control. They may remain for a season and disappear without asking your permission. If your peace depends on them, then your peace will vanish with them. You already know this, and yet you resist it every day. You know you cannot control whether someone respects you, yet you spend hours replaying their judgment in your mind. You know you cannot control the future, yet you exhaust yourself imagining disasters that do not exist. You know you cannot control whether people remain loyal, yet you cling to them with fear instead of meeting them with honesty and courage. You know you cannot force success, yet you torture yourself over outcomes while neglecting the quality of your effort. This is the undisciplined mind. It confuses influence with control. It confuses preference with entitlement. It confuses desire with reality. The disciplined mind does something different. It separates what belongs to it from what does not. It understands that your judgments belong to you. Your choices belong to you. Your willingness to act with courage belongs to you. Your ability to remain honest under pressure belongs to you. Your response to hardship belongs to you. Your character belongs to you. And once a person understands this distinction clearly, their life changes completely. Because now another person's insult cannot reach the center of them unless they permit it. Failure cannot destroy them because they never placed their worth inside outcomes. Delay cannot disturb them because they trained themselves to work patiently. Loss cannot reduce them because they built their identity on virtue instead of possession. This is not emotional numbness. This is self-governance. There is a difference. The weak person reacts automatically to everything. Their mood rises and falls according to circumstances. They become angry when ignored, bitter when criticized, arrogant when praised, fearful when uncertain. They do not govern themselves, they are governed by events. You see this everywhere. A man receives criticism at work and carries rage home to his family. A woman feels rejected and immediately questions her worth. Someone loses money and behaves as though life itself has ended. Someone encounters discomfort and abandons discipline instantly. Their inner condition changes because external conditions changed. This is slavery of the mind. The Stoic refuses this slavery, not because life becomes easier, but because they stop demanding control over what was never theirs. You must understand this deeply. Freedom is not controlling events. Freedom is controlling yourself within events. The storm may come, people may betray you, your plans may fail, your body may weaken, society may become foolish. None of this removes your power to choose your response. None of it can force you to become dishonest, cowardly, resentful, or self-pitying unless you surrender your judgment willingly. This is where real strength begins, not in forcing life to obey you, but in refusing to abandon reason, no matter what life does. Most people spend their entire existence fighting reality. They argue with the past. They fear the future. They resent the present. Then they wonder why peace never stays with them. Peace cannot exist in a mind that refuses to accept the limits of its control. Look carefully at your own thoughts throughout the day. Watch how often you suffer over things completely outside your authority. Someone does not answer your message quickly enough, and your mind creates stories. Traffic delays you, and you become angry as though rage can move cars. A stranger speaks carelessly, and you carry their words for hours. You check constantly whether others approve of you. You seek security in unstable things and panic when instability appears. This is not strength. This is dependence, and dependence creates fear. The person who depends on praise fears criticism. The person who depends on comfort fears hardship. The person who depends on success fears failure. The person who depends on external stability fears change. They become emotionally fragile because they attached themselves to unstable things. But the Stoic trains differently. The Stoic says this clearly every morning. Some things are within my control. Some things are not. My task is not to rule the world. My task is to rule myself. That single realization cuts through endless suffering. Imagine what would happen if you truly practiced this for 1 week, not as theory but as discipline. Every time frustration appears, you stop and ask yourself one question: is this under my control or not? Someone insults you. Their words are not under your control. Your response is, a plan fails. The outcome is no longer under your control. Your next action is, your body becomes tired. The existence of fatigue may not be your choice. Whether you complain uselessly or endure it with dignity is. Another person behaves selfishly. Their character is not yours to govern. Your own honesty remains available to you. This practice sounds simple because truth often is simple, but simplicity does not make it easy. The ego resists surrendering control. The ego wants the world arranged according to personal preference. It wants comfort, certainty, recognition, and obedience from others. And when life refuses these demands, the ego becomes angry, frightened, and bitter. Stoic discipline begins when you stop negotiating with reality. Reality does not care about your preferences. The seasons change, bodies age, people disappoint, death arrives, time passes. No amount of complaining alters this. The mature mind accepts this completely and asks a better question. Given reality as it is, how should I live well today? That question returns power to you. Now your energy no longer leaks into resentment and fear. It becomes available for action, discipline, patience, and virtue. You stop wasting life trying to force outcomes and begin focusing on the quality of your own conduct. This changes the entire atmosphere of your mind. Because the person obsessed with outcomes is always anxious. They need guarantees before acting. They need certainty before committing. They need success before beginning. But certainty never comes, so they remain trapped in hesitation and fear. The Stoic acts differently. The Stoic focuses fully on effort and character, while accepting uncertainty calmly. They understand that outcomes belong partly to fate and partly to circumstance, but integrity belongs entirely to them. This is why the disciplined person appears calm under pressure, not because they expect life to be gentle, but because they trained themselves to stop demanding control over uncontrollable things. You must train this daily, not occasionally, not when convenient. Daily. In the morning, sit quietly before the noise of the world reaches you. Ask yourself what truly belongs to your control today: your attention, your honesty, your effort, your patience, your courage, your restraint. Then remind yourself what does not belong to you: the opinions of strangers, the weather, the economy, the moods of other people, the final outcome of every plan. Carry this distinction into every moment. When irritation appears, pause immediately. Do not obey the first impulse. Most people react before examining their judgment. They feel anger and assume anger must be justified. They feel fear and assume danger must be overwhelming. They feel embarrassment and assume their value decreased. But feelings are not commands, they are impressions, and impressions must be examined before accepted. This is one of the greatest forms of inner freedom, the ability to pause between event and reaction. A person without this pause becomes an animal driven by impulse. A person with this pause becomes capable of reasoned choice. So practice the pause relentlessly. Someone provokes you. Pause. You receive bad news. Pause. You feel fear rising in your chest. Pause. Then ask yourself, what exactly is under your authority right now? You will discover that even in difficult situations, something remains available to you. Patience remains available. Honesty remains available. Self-control remains available. Rational judgment remains available. That is enough. The undisciplined mind always says this should not be happening. The disciplined mind says this is happening and now I must respond well. Do you see the difference? One resists reality and suffers. The other accepts reality and acts with strength. This principle must also guide how you deal with other people. Much of your suffering comes from trying to control human beings. You want them to understand you perfectly. You want them to behave according to your standards. You want loyalty without weakness, gratitude without selfishness, consistency without contradiction. But human beings are imperfect, including you. The Stoic understands this before entering the day. People will sometimes act ignorantly. Some will lie. Some will disappoint you. Some will misunderstand your intentions completely. If you expect perfection from imperfect people, you guarantee bitterness. But if you expect human weakness while remaining committed to your own virtue, then their behavior loses the power to disturb your inner stability. This does not mean accepting injustice passively. It means responding without surrendering your reason. You can correct someone without hatred. You can walk away without resentment. You can protect yourself without becoming cruel. Your character must not become hostage to another person's behavior. That is the deeper lesson. Do not allow another person's ignorance to turn you into someone you would be ashamed to become. There is also another trap you must face honestly. Many people claim they want peace, but secretly they are addicted to emotional chaos. They replay arguments repeatedly. They seek constant validation. They monitor every opinion others hold about them. They dramatize every inconvenience. Why? Because they never trained their mind to stand independently from external conditions. Peace feels unfamiliar to them. Because dependence feels normal. You must break this habit deliberately. Spend time alone without distraction. Observe how quickly your mind reaches for external stimulation. Observe how uncomfortable silence feels when you have avoided yourself for years. The person who cannot sit quietly with their own thoughts has not yet become free. Learn to remain still. Learn to examine your own judgments honestly. At night, review your day carefully. Ask yourself where you surrendered control unnecessarily. Where did you become angry over what was never yours to command? Where did fear enter because you demanded certainty? Where did another person's opinion control your mood? Where did comfort weaken your discipline? Do not lie to yourself during this examination. Self-deception is the enemy of growth. The purpose is not guilt. The purpose is correction. Every day you either strengthen self-governance or strengthen emotional slavery. There is no neutral direction. Every reaction becomes practice. Every complaint becomes training. Every disciplined response becomes evidence that reason is gaining authority over impulse. Understand this clearly. The goal is not to become untouched by feeling. The goal is to stop becoming ruled by feeling. You will still feel pain. You will still experience disappointment. You will still grieve losses, but you will no longer collapse beneath them because your identity no longer depends on controlling reality itself. Your stability will come from your commitment to virtue, and virtue cannot be taken from you by accident. It can only be abandoned willingly. That is why external events cannot truly harm a disciplined person unless they cooperate with the harm internally. Poverty cannot force dishonesty. Criticism cannot force cowardice. Failure cannot force self-pity. Only your own judgment can do that. This is difficult because it removes excuses. Once you understand the distinction between what belongs to you and what does not, you can no longer blame circumstances for the condition of your character. You become responsible, fully responsible. And many people fear this responsibility more than suffering itself. Because now the question changes from why is life unfair to why do I continue surrendering my peace to unstable things? That question demands courage, but it also opens the door to freedom. Imagine a life where your inner condition no longer depends on applause, success, comfort, or approval. Imagine waking each morning focused only on living with clarity, discipline, justice, and courage. Imagine meeting difficulty without panic because you trained yourself to separate events from judgment. Imagine no longer wasting years demanding control over people, outcomes, and circumstances beyond your reach. This is not fantasy. This is practice. And the practice begins now, not tomorrow, not after life becomes easier. Now, because every day you delay this work, you strengthen the habits currently governing your mind. Every uncontrolled reaction becomes easier next time. Every complaint deepens dependence. Every excuse weakens character. Life is moving quickly whether you govern yourself or not. Time is removing possibilities from your hands every hour. Your body changes. Opportunities disappear. Death approaches silently while people waste years arguing with reality and chasing approval from strangers. Do not live that way any longer. Stand guard over your mind. Separate clearly what belongs to you from what never did. Protect your judgment from panic, resentment, vanity, and fear. Return your attention to your own conduct. And when life becomes difficult, remember this: the event itself is not your enemy. Your unexamined reaction is. Master that reaction, and you begin to master your life. Fail to master it, and the world will control you through every inconvenience, temptation, and fear until your final day. The choice is present in this moment exactly where it has always been. Not in the hands of fate, not in the behavior of others, not in perfect circumstances. In you. Number 2. Accept events without complaint and protect your judgment. Your suffering grows each time reality refuses your demands and you answer with complaint instead of discipline. The moment life moves against your preference, your mind begins accusing the world as though existence itself has wronged you. A delay becomes an outrage. A mistake becomes a personal attack. A difficult person becomes proof that peace is impossible. You speak as if events themselves are responsible for the condition of your inner life. But look carefully. The event arrives first. Your judgment arrives second. Between those two moments, your freedom either survives or collapses. A person loses control of themselves long before they lose control of circumstances. You have trained yourself to react before thinking. That is why small inconveniences disturb you more than serious hardships disturb a disciplined mind. You do not suffer because life contains difficulty. You suffer because your judgments are weak, careless, and undisciplined. You have allowed habit to govern your responses instead of reason. Listen closely to your own speech throughout the day. Every complaint reveals a hidden belief that life should obey your personal desires. Every outburst exposes an expectation that the world must arrange itself according to your comfort. Every moment of bitterness announces attachment to something outside your authority. Complaint is not harmless. Complaint trains the mind toward helplessness. Each time you complain without examining yourself, you strengthen the belief that peace depends on external conditions. You tell your mind that calmness is impossible unless people behave correctly, unless plans unfold perfectly, unless discomfort disappears, unless life grants constant convenience. This is why so many people remain emotionally fragile, even while their external lives improve. Their thinking remains undisciplined. The Stoic mind understands something difficult but liberating. Events themselves do not possess the power to corrupt your character. Your judgment about those events does. A storm ruins your plans. One person curses the day and sinks into frustration. Another adapts quietly and continues their work. The storm was the same. The judgment was different. Someone criticizes you unfairly. One person becomes consumed by anger for weeks. Another examines the criticism carefully and discards what is false without hatred. The words were the same. The judgment was different. Pain enters your life. One person turns pain into self-pity and resentment. Another uses pain to strengthen endurance and clarity. The hardship was the same. The judgment was different. This is the battlefield where your life is decided, not in the event itself, but in the interpretation you choose afterward. The undisciplined mind accepts every first impression as truth. It feels insulted and immediately believes it has been harmed. It feels discomfort and immediately declares the situation unbearable. It feels uncertainty and immediately imagines disaster. This is not wisdom. This is surrender. Your first reaction is not always your wisest reaction. You must learn to delay agreement with your impulses. This single discipline changes the entire structure of the inner life. The moment something unpleasant happens, your task is not to react instantly. Your task is to observe your judgment before giving it permission to rule you. A difficult conversation begins. Your anger rises. Pause before speaking. An unexpected setback appears. Your fear starts building stories. Pause before believing them. Someone disrespects you publicly. Your pride demands retaliation. Pause before obeying it. That pause is where reason enters. Without this discipline, your emotions become dictators. They command your speech, your behavior, your decisions, and eventually your character. A person who never examines their reactions becomes predictable to every circumstance around them. Their mood depends entirely on external events. They call this being emotional or sensitive or passionate. In truth, it is dependence. The Stoic refuses dependence on unstable things. This does not mean becoming cold or detached from humanity. It means refusing to hand your inner condition to accidents and circumstances. It means understanding that while events may touch your body, your possessions, or your plans, they do not automatically gain authority over your judgment. That authority remains yours unless surrendered. Look honestly at how quickly you surrender it now. A stranger online changes your mood for hours. One moment of embarrassment alters your confidence for days. Someone fails to appreciate your effort, and suddenly resentment grows inside you. Your thoughts become chained to the actions of people who do not even govern themselves properly. Why would you trust your peace to minds as unstable as your own once was? The disciplined person protects their judgment carefully because they understand that the quality of life depends upon the quality of interpretation. They do not rush to label events as terrible simply because they feel unpleasant. They know discomfort and destruction are not the same thing. A difficult task is uncomfortable, but it may strengthen discipline. Criticism is uncomfortable, but it may expose weakness requiring correction. Loss is uncomfortable, but it may teach detachment from temporary things. Silence from others is uncomfortable, but it may reveal unhealthy dependence on validation. The undisciplined person only asks whether something feels good immediately. The disciplined person asks whether their response remains honorable, rational, and aligned with virtue. This changes how you face adversity completely. Instead of asking why this is happening to me, you begin asking what kind of person this situation invites me to become. Now hardship becomes training rather than punishment. You stop viewing obstacles as personal insults from fate. You begin seeing them as opportunities to practice steadiness, justice, patience, courage, and restraint. The difficult coworker becomes practice for self-control. Financial pressure becomes practice for simplicity. Physical discomfort becomes practice for endurance. Uncertainty becomes practice for trust in reason over panic. This is not passive resignation. The Stoic never says everything is acceptable. The Stoic says everything can be met with disciplined judgment. There is immense power in this distinction, because once you understand that your judgment remains yours, you stop behaving like a victim of every circumstance. You stop demanding a painless existence before agreeing to live well. You stop postponing discipline until conditions become ideal. Conditions will never become ideal. People will continue disappointing you. The body will become tired. Mistakes will occur. Society will remain confused. Delays will interrupt plans. Illness and death will continue visiting human life as they always have. Complaint changes none of this. What complaint does change is your own character. Every repeated complaint trains impatience. Every exaggerated reaction trains weakness. Every refusal to accept reality trains bitterness. You become what you practice daily. If you practice outrage, your mind becomes outraged easily. If you practice self-pity, your mind seeks reasons to feel wronged. If you practice calm examination, your mind learns steadiness. This is why the Stoic guards attention carefully. You cannot control every event entering your life, but you can control whether your mind becomes reckless in response. Many people live as though every emotional impulse deserves immediate expression. They say whatever anger demands. They follow whatever fear suggests. They indulge every anxious thought, as though thinking it automatically makes it true. Then they wonder why their lives feel chaotic. Chaos in the mind eventually becomes chaos in behavior. The disciplined person interrupts this process early. They examine impressions before accepting them. They ask whether the judgment is accurate. They ask whether the reaction serves virtue or merely satisfies impulse. They ask whether the mind is seeing clearly or exaggerating emotionally. This requires honesty many people avoid, because sometimes the problem is not the event. The problem is your vanity, your entitlement, your impatience, your attachment to comfort, your fear of discomfort, your addiction to approval. The event only exposed what was already weak within you. That realization hurts the ego, but without it, no transformation is possible. You cannot govern a mind you refuse to examine. This is why daily reflection matters. At the end of each day, sit quietly and review your reactions without excuse. Where did complaint enter today? Which events disturbed your peace unnecessarily? Which judgments exaggerated harm? Which fears controlled behavior? Which desires made you restless? Do not perform this examination to punish yourself. Perform it to sharpen awareness. A person who notices their patterns clearly has already begun changing them. The undisciplined person avoids this reflection because they fear responsibility. They prefer blaming circumstances rather than correcting themselves. But the Stoic accepts responsibility willingly because responsibility returns power to the individual. Once you recognize that your judgment shapes your suffering, you no longer need to wait for the world to change before reclaiming stability. You can begin immediately. The next time frustration rises, do not say, "This ruined my day." Ask instead, what judgment inside me is creating this disturbance? The next time someone behaves unfairly, do not rush toward outrage. Ask whether you will allow another person's ignorance to govern your own conduct. The next time anxiety appears, do not automatically believe every prediction produced by fear. Ask whether your mind is describing reality or inventing catastrophe. This discipline must become constant, not occasional reflection performed only during crisis. Constant watchfulness over the movements of the mind, because the greatest danger is not external difficulty. The greatest danger is becoming careless with your own thinking. A careless mind destroys peace from within. It turns inconvenience into misery. It turns uncertainty into panic. It turns criticism into identity. It turns temporary pain into permanent bitterness. Then it wonders why life feels heavy. Your life feels heavy because your judgments add unnecessary weight to every event. The Stoic seeks simplicity of mind. See the event clearly. Respond according to reason. Release what cannot be controlled. Return attention to virtue. This prevents emotional excess from multiplying suffering beyond reality itself. You must also understand that acceptance does not mean liking everything that happens. Acceptance means refusing to waste energy denying facts already present. If illness arrives, then illness is present. If loss occurs, then loss has occurred. If another person chooses dishonesty, then dishonesty has appeared. Fighting reality internally after reality has already unfolded only deepens suffering. The mature mind faces facts directly. It does not collapse into denial, self-pity, or dramatic complaint. It asks calmly, what must now be done? That question preserves dignity even in hardship. You may not control events, but you always participate in shaping your response. This is where character becomes visible. Anyone can appear calm during comfort. True discipline appears when life becomes difficult, unexpected, unfair, or painful. Then the quality of your judgments is revealed. Then you discover whether your philosophy is genuine or merely words repeated during easy seasons. Train now before crisis arrives. Practice accepting small inconveniences without complaint. Wait patiently in silence. Endure discomfort without dramatizing it. Receive criticism without immediate defensiveness. Lose minor pleasures without resentment. These small exercises strengthen the mind for greater trials later. A person who cannot bear small frustrations peacefully will collapse beneath larger burdens. But the person who practices disciplined judgment daily develops inner stability gradually. Their peace stops depending on constant external satisfaction. They become harder to provoke because they stopped expecting life to obey personal preference. This freedom is available to you now if you stop abandoning reason every time reality challenges your comfort. No one else can do this work for you. No book can practice restraint in your place. No teacher can govern your reactions for you. No amount of intelligence matters if impressions continue controlling your judgment automatically. The work is internal and constant. moment by moment, choice by choice, judgment by judgment. You either strengthen reason or strengthen impulse every day you live. And understand this clearly before the day ends. A complaining mind never finds peace because it has trained itself to search constantly for reasons to resist reality. But a disciplined mind finds steadiness even during difficulty because it no longer demands that life become painless before it agrees to remain calm, honorable, and rational. Protect your judgment carefully. Your peace depends upon it more than wealth, reputation, comfort, or success ever will. Once your judgment becomes disciplined, the world loses much of its power to disturb you. Not because life becomes softer, but because your mind becomes stronger. Number 3. Examine every impression before you grant it power. The first moment of your suffering is never the event itself, but the instant you accept an impression without examination. A word is spoken, and immediately you decide it is an insult. A situation changes, and immediately you decide it is a disaster. A face looks at you a certain way, and immediately you decide it means rejection. You do not wait. You do not test the impression. You do not question it. You obey it. And in that obedience, your mind loses its authority. Your inner life is not destroyed by reality, but by unexamined interpretation. Every day, countless impressions pass through your mind like messengers entering a city. Some are truthful, some are distorted, some are incomplete, some are entirely false, yet you rarely question them. You open the gates of your judgment and allow anything that arrives to claim authority over your emotions. A passing thought becomes a belief, a sudden feeling becomes a conclusion, a fear becomes a prediction, a desire becomes a command. You live as though the first appearance of a thought is already truth. This is how confusion governs a human life. You must see this clearly. Your mind does not suffer because impressions appear. Your mind suffers because you grant impressions immediate power without examinations. Between the arrival of a thought and your acceptance of it lies your freedom. Most people never enter that space. They collapse it instantly. They feel and they believe at the same time. They react and they decide at the same time. They imagine and they accept at the same time. This collapse is the source of emotional instability. A disciplined mind refuses this collapse. It does not reject impressions blindly. It does not suppress thought. It does something more precise. It examines, it questions, it delays agreement until clarity is present. This is the foundation of inner freedom. Imagine a guard at a gate who lets every traveler enter without asking who they are or where they come from. Some carry goods that strengthen the city, others carry weapons that destroy it. Without examination, the city becomes unsafe not because of the travelers themselves, but because of the absence of discernment. Your mind functions the same way. Every impression that passes through unchecked becomes part of your inner condition. You are responsible for the quality of what you allow inside. The undisciplined mind believes every thought deserves respect simply because it appeared. But appearance is not truth. A thought can arise from fear, it can arise from memory distortion, it can arise from misunderstanding, it can arise from fatigue or anger, it can arise from habit rather than reality. Yet you often treat all of them as valid without investigation. This is mental negligence, and mental negligence creates unnecessary suffering faster than external events ever could. You receive a message that is short and immediately conclude someone is angry with you. You experience silence and immediately conclude you are being ignored. You face delay and immediately conclude something is going wrong. You feel anxiety and immediately conclude danger is present. You feel attraction and immediately conclude it must be acted upon. Each impression arrives and you hand it authority without resistance. But what if the impression is wrong? What if the thought is incomplete? What if the feeling is misleading? What if your interpretation is shaped more by habit than by truth? The Stoic life begins when you start asking these questions before reacting. This practice is not emotional suppression. It is intellectual honesty. It is the recognition that your first impression is not always your best judgment. You do not trust every stranger who speaks to you in the physical world. You verify, you question, you seek evidence, yet you trust every internal impression without hesitation. This contradiction reveals how untrained the inner life often is. You must learn to treat your own mind as something requiring supervision, not because it is unreliable by nature, but because it is untrained by habit. The discipline is simple in structure but difficult in execution. When an impression appears, you pause before granting it authority. You observe it as something separate from truth. You ask whether it is aligned with reality or merely a reaction. You examine whether it belongs to the present moment or is borrowed from past fear. You determine whether it supports clear action or fuels confusion. This pause is where mastery begins. Without it, impressions rule you. With it, you begin to rule impressions. Most people never realize how often they confuse interpretation with fact. A colleague looks distant and the mind says, "I am disliked." A plan changes and the mind says, "I am failing." A person disagrees and the mind says, "I am under attack." In each case, a neutral event becomes emotionally charged through unchecked interpretation. The suffering does not come from what happened, but from what was added to what happened. The added layer is always judgment. This is why training the mind to examine impressions is essential. You are not trying to eliminate thought. You are trying to refine it. You are learning to separate raw perception from premature conclusion. You are learning to slow down the movement from seeing to believing. A person without this discipline lives inside constant inner noise. Every thought feels urgent. Every fear feels valid. Every assumption feels factual. Their mind becomes crowded with unverified claims that shape their emotions. They react not to reality but to mental interpretations that may have no foundation. The Stoic mind filters before it reacts. It asks a simple but powerful question. Is this impression describing reality or merely interpreting it? That question alone dissolves much unnecessary suffering. But you must apply it consistently, not occasionally. The strength of this practice lies in repetition. Each time you examine an impression, instead of obeying it, you weaken impulsive thinking. Each time you accept an impression without question, you strengthen it. Your inner life is shaped through accumulation of these small decisions. This is why self-awareness must be constant. In the morning, you set intention before impressions begin to accumulate. You remind yourself that not every thought deserves acceptance. You prepare yourself to observe the mind rather than follow it blindly. You decide in advance that reason will act as your guide and not emotional impulse. During the day, you practice interruption. When a strong impression appears, you do not immediately act. You create a gap. In that gap, you regain control. You notice the impression without merging with it. You treat it as something passing through awareness rather than something defining awareness. This prevents emotional identification with every passing thought. At night, you review your judgments. You observe where you accepted impressions too quickly. You identify moments where interpretation replaced reality. You study how many unnecessary reactions were created by unexamined thinking. This reflection is not punishment, it is training. It strengthens awareness for the next day. Over time, this practice transforms your relationship with thought itself. You begin to notice that most emotional disturbance begins as a single unexamined impression. One assumption accepted too quickly becomes a chain of reactions. One imagined interpretation becomes hours of anxiety. One distorted belief becomes unnecessary conflict. When you interrupt the first step, you prevent the entire chain from forming. This is true inner efficiency. The undisciplined mind reacts to every impression as though it is already proven. The disciplined mind withholds judgment until clarity appears. This does not slow life down, it stabilizes it. Because clarity produces correct action, while confusion produces unnecessary struggle. You are not required to believe everything you think. This realization alone changes the structure of your freedom. Right now, your mind may be filled with impressions that feel urgent but are not accurate. You may feel rejected without evidence. You may feel threatened without danger. You may feel inadequate based on comparison rather than truth. If you grant these impressions immediate authority, you suffer unnecessarily. If you examine them, you regain control. Examination restores power to reason, and reason is the only stable guide in a changing world. You cannot control every impression that arises, but you can control whether it governs you. You can observe it, you can question it, you can delay agreement, you can choose response over reaction. This is where your actual strength lives, not in preventing thoughts from appearing, but in refusing to be ruled by unverified ones. Every moment offers this choice: accept or examine, react or pause, believe or question, surrender judgment or govern it. The quality of your life depends on which option you practice more often. If you continue to accept impressions without scrutiny, your life will feel reactive, unstable, and emotionally driven. If you begin to examine them consistently, your mind will become steady regardless of external events. This is not philosophy removed from daily life. This is the structure of every interaction, every emotion, and every decision you experience. The discipline begins now, not when your mind becomes calm, not when life becomes easier. Now, because every impression you accept without examination strengthens the habit of impulsive thinking, and every impression you examine strengthens the habit of rational control. Stand between thought and action. Do not let impressions pass through you unchallenged. Learn to see clearly before you believe, and in that clarity you will discover something most people never experience. A mind that is no longer ruled by what it merely thinks in passing. A mind that chooses what it allows to become real. Number 4. Discipline desire, so your peace depends on virtue. You keep calling it desire as if it is harmless, as if it is simply preference or taste, as if it cannot rule your entire life from behind your eyes. But watch your own mind without excuse and you will see something sharper. Desire is not passive. Desire is a command structure. It tells you what matters before reason is consulted. It tells you what is urgent before truth is examined. It tells you what must be gained or avoided before you have asked whether it is even within your control. And when desire speaks without discipline, your mind stops governing itself and starts obeying impulses it never questioned. This is where your peace begins to break, not in the world outside you, but in the moment you decide that something external must determine your inner state. You tell yourself that if a certain outcome arrives, then you will be calm. If a certain person responds, then you will be steady. If a certain achievement is reached, then you will finally be enough. If comfort is secured, then you will finally relax. Each of these conditions places your peace into a fragile contract with events you do not control. And anything placed under external control is already unstable. You do not suffer because you have desire. You suffer because desire has become your ruler. Look at how quickly your mood shifts when desire is challenged. When you do not receive what you want, irritation appears. When you might lose what you want, anxiety appears. When someone else has what you want, comparison appears. When progress is slow, frustration appears. Your emotional world rises and collapses around the movement of external outcomes. This is not strength of feeling, it is lack of inner governance. A disciplined mind begins by separating desire from authority. It does not eliminate preference. It does not deny ambition. It does not suppress effort. It changes the location of peace. Peace is no longer placed in outcomes. Peace is placed in character. Peace is no longer dependent on receiving. Peace is dependent on acting rightly. Peace is no longer tied to possession. Peace is tied to virtue. Virtue is nothing more than correct use of reason under all circumstances. It is honesty without distortion. It is courage without avoidance. It is fairness without bias. It is self-control without excess. It is clarity in judgment even when emotion pushes for distortion. When your peace depends on virtue, nothing external can fully remove it, because nothing external can directly command your reasoning unless you surrender it. But most people surrender it constantly without noticing. You desire approval, so you bend your behavior to gain it. You desire comfort, so you avoid necessary discipline. You desire success, so you become anxious and scattered. You desire certainty, so you refuse to act until guarantees appear. You desire control over others, so you become frustrated when they remain independent. In each case, desire does not remain a preference. It becomes a master directing your decisions. This is how life becomes unstable, even when external conditions are stable. You are not reacting to reality. You are reacting to unmet desire. And unmet desire always produces tension when it is treated as essential rather than optional. The Stoic mind does not allow desire to define necessity. It distinguishes clearly between what is good in terms of action and what is merely preferred in terms of outcome. Effort is within your control. Integrity is within your control. Thoughtful action is within your control. But results are not fully within your control. When you confuse these categories, you create constant frustration. You begin to treat outcomes as moral judgments about yourself. Success becomes identity, failure becomes shame, approval becomes worth, disapproval becomes collapse. This is how a human being becomes emotionally dependent on things that shift without warning. You must see how unreasonable this structure is. If your worth depends on what you cannot fully govern, then your worth is permanently unstable. If your peace depends on what others decide, then your peace is permanently vulnerable. If your self-respect depends on outcomes shaped by chance, then your self-respect is permanently fragile. No rational mind would build its foundation on such unstable ground, yet most people do it unconsciously every day. The disciplined life begins when you stop confusing desire with requirement. You are allowed to prefer success without requiring it for peace. You are allowed to seek comfort without depending on it for stability. You are allowed to aim for recognition without needing it for self-respect. You are allowed to pursue relationships without demanding them to define your value. The moment desire becomes demand, suffering begins. Therefore, the first act of discipline is inner clarification. Before you act, you ask yourself what exactly you are pursuing and whether your peace is tied to it. If it is tied, you are not free. If it is tied, you are already vulnerable. If it is tied, your mind is no longer guided by reason but by attachment. This is why your daily inner work must begin before the world demands your attention. In the morning, before distractions enter, you examine what you are likely to desire that day. You identify where your mind tends to attach itself. You notice what outcomes you usually depend on for emotional stability. You bring awareness to the subtle expectation that life must meet certain conditions before you can remain calm. Then you loosen that expectation deliberately. You remind yourself that you will act with full effort regardless of outcome. You remind yourself that you will choose honesty regardless of reward. You remind yourself that you will maintain self-control regardless of temptation. You remind yourself that your judgment will remain steady even if external events shift unpredictably. This is preparation for independence from desire. During the day, every time desire rises strongly, you pause and question whether it is aligned with reason or whether it is attempting to take control. You observe whether it is pushing you toward action that maintains integrity or toward action that merely satisfies impulse. You notice whether it is narrowing your thinking into urgency or expanding it into clarity. Desire often speaks in urgency. Reason speaks in steadiness. When desire says you must have this now, reason asks whether this is truly necessary for a good life. When desire says avoid discomfort, reason asks whether avoidance weakens character. When desire says pursue approval, reason asks whether approval changes truth. When desire says fear loss, reason asks whether anything external was ever truly owned. This questioning weakens the automatic power of desire. You are not trying to erase desire, you are trying to restore hierarchy within the mind. Reason must lead, desire must follow. When this order is reversed, the mind becomes unstable. When this order is restored, the mind becomes resilient. Consider how much of your exhaustion comes not from work itself, but from desire attached to outcomes. You are not only working, you are hoping, fearing, expecting, comparing, and projecting. Each desire adds emotional weight to action. Each attachment increases internal pressure. The result is not just effort, but emotional turbulence layered on top of effort. A disciplined person removes unnecessary weight by detaching peace from results. They work fully without demanding outcomes to validate them. They pursue goals without requiring them to define worth. They engage with life without turning every event into emotional measurement of success or failure. This creates clarity even in difficult circumstances. You must understand that desire unexamined always multiplies suffering. It never remains contained. It expands into fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of missing out, fear of inadequacy. One desire becomes many anxieties when it is not governed by reason. That is why inner discipline is not about restriction. It is about protection. You are protecting your mind from being scattered across endless dependencies. Every desire that becomes necessary weakens your independence. Every attachment that becomes identity reduces your freedom. Every expectation that becomes demand increases vulnerability. Freedom is not having everything you want. Freedom is not needing external conditions to be stable in yourself. To reach this state, you must repeatedly return to a simple distinction: what is under my control and what is not. Your choices are under your control. Your character is under your control. Your effort is under your control. But outcomes are not. Approval is not. Circumstances are not. Other people are not. Once this is understood clearly, desire loses its tyrannical authority. You can still pursue goals. You can still act with ambition. You can still engage deeply with life. But you no longer place your inner stability inside those pursuits. You begin to act for the sake of virtue itself, not for the emotional reward you hope it will bring. This shift changes everything, because now your actions remain steady even when outcomes fluctuate. Your mind remains stable even when circumstances shift. Your identity remains intact even when external validation disappears. You are no longer dependent on the world behaving in a certain way for you to remain composed. At night, you examine where desire controlled you unnecessarily. You review moments where you acted from attachment rather than reason. You observe where fear of loss influenced decisions. You notice where craving approval shaped behavior. You identify where impatience distorted judgment. This reflection is not self-judgment. It is correction of direction. Through repetition, awareness grows stronger than impulse. Over time, you begin to notice desire earlier, before it fully takes control. You recognize its patterns. You see how it tries to present itself as urgency or necessity, and you learn to pause before it becomes action. In that pause, you regain freedom. The world does not change in that moment, but your relationship to the world changes completely. You are no longer dragged by every impulse. You are no longer destabilized by every want. You are no longer defined by what you lack or fear losing. Instead, you are guided by reason acting in service of virtue. And when that becomes the center of your life, external events lose their power to determine your inner state, not because life becomes easy, but because your mind stops depending on life to be easy in order to remain steady. This is the discipline of desire, not suppression, not denial, but transformation of dependence into independence, and transformation of craving into clarity. Number 5. Endure pain calmly and refuse to become smaller. Pain enters your life, and immediately your mind begins negotiating with it as if suffering itself is a violation of justice. You resist it, you complain about it, you tighten inwardly against it, and in that resistance something more damaging than pain begins to form. You begin to shrink, not in body but in character, not in circumstance but in spirit. You become smaller than the difficulty in front of you because you believe pain has authority over your inner life. But pain has no authority over your judgment unless you give it that authority. The moment discomfort appears, your mind produces interpretations faster than reason can intervene. It says this should not be happening. It says I cannot handle this. It says this is unfair. It says this is too much. None of these statements describe the pain itself. They describe your judgment about pain, and that judgment is where suffering is multiplied beyond necessity. Pain is a sensation. Suffering is a conclusion. One belongs to the body, the other belongs to the mind, and only one of them is under your control. Most people live as though pain automatically dictates behavior. They treat discomfort as a command rather than an experience. When pain arrives, they immediately contract inwardly, abandoning clarity, abandoning patience, abandoning reason. They allow sensation to dictate identity. But sensation is not identity. It is temporary information passing through the body. You are not required to become smaller in response to what you feel. This is the first discipline. You separate experience from interpretation. You do not deny pain. You do not exaggerate it. You do not turn it into a story about your weakness. You observe it as something present, not something defining. The moment you label pain as unbearable, you stop engaging with reality and begin engaging with fear. Fear always enlarges pain beyond its actual boundary. A disciplined mind refuses this distortion. It asks a simple question when pain appears. What exactly is happening right now, without addition or exaggeration? The answer is always more limited than the mind's initial reaction suggests. There is discomfort in the body. There is difficulty in the situation. There is pressure in the moment. But there is not destruction of your capacity to respond with reason unless you abandon reason voluntarily. The danger is never pain itself. The danger is the surrender of judgment to pain. You must see how often your life has been shaped, not by what you endured, but by how quickly you collapsed inwardly when endurance was required. You withdraw from effort because discomfort appears. You abandon discipline because resistance is felt. You avoid responsibility because difficulty is present. And each time you do this, you train yourself to become smaller than life demands. This shrinking is not physical. It is moral. It is the slow weakening of your ability to remain steady under pressure. It is the gradual replacement of reason with impulse. It is the habit of prioritizing comfort over integrity. A person who repeatedly avoids discomfort becomes dependent on comfort to function. And when comfort is absent, they feel disoriented, not because life has changed, but because their tolerance for reality has weakened. You must reverse this process deliberately. Endurance is not something you wait to discover. It is something you practice in small forms so that larger forms do not overwhelm you. Each moment of discomfort is a training ground for stability of mind. Each instance of pain is an opportunity to refuse collapse. Each difficulty is a chance to prove that your character is not controlled by sensation. When pain arrives, your task is not to eliminate it immediately. Your task is to maintain clarity while it is present. This is where most people fail. They believe clarity requires absence of discomfort. They believe rational thought only exists in calm conditions. But this belief itself is weakness disguised as logic. Reason is not dependent on comfort. Reason is tested precisely when comfort disappears. You discover your strength not in peaceful conditions but in pressured ones. The first step in endurance is separation. You separate what is happening from what you are telling yourself about what is happening. The body may feel strain, the situation may be difficult, but your interpretation must remain under examination. If your interpretation becomes exaggerated, your response becomes unstable. If your interpretation remains accurate, your response remains steady. This is why inner dialogue matters more than external conditions. A person in pain who tells themselves, "I am destroyed," collapses internally. A person in pain who tells themselves this is difficult but manageable remains upright. The external reality is identical. The internal judgment is different, and that difference determines whether you shrink or remain whole. You must refuse language that weakens your character. Words like unbearable, impossible, ruined, broken, finished are not descriptions of reality. They are emotional distortions. They create identity out of temporary sensation. A disciplined mind removes these distortions immediately. It replaces them with clarity. This is uncomfortable. This is challenging. This requires patience. This requires effort. But I remain capable of responding with reason. That shift alone preserves dignity under pressure. Pain does not require collapse. It requires attention. Attention without panic. Attention without distortion. Attention without surrendering judgment. When you attend to pain without emotional exaggeration, something important happens. The experience becomes contained within its actual limits. It stops expanding into imagined catastrophe. It stops invading unrelated areas of life. It becomes what it is, not what fear tries to make it. This containment is strength. It allows you to remain functional even in difficulty. It prevents suffering from spreading beyond its source. It keeps your reasoning intact, so that appropriate action can still be taken. You are not asked to enjoy pain. You are asked to refuse unnecessary submission to it. There is a difference between feeling discomfort and becoming defined by discomfort. One is unavoidable, the other is optional. The Stoic discipline is not the absence of pain. It is the refusal to allow pain to determine moral direction or mental stability. You can still think clearly while uncomfortable. You can still act justly while under pressure. You can still remain honest while facing difficulty. You can still choose patience while experiencing strain. None of these capacities disappear unless you abandon them. This is where true resilience is formed, not in resisting sensation, but in maintaining integrity within sensation. You must also recognize how quickly pain can distort memory and expectation. When suffering appears, the mind begins rewriting the past as if everything was always difficult. It begins projecting the future as if nothing will improve. It compresses time into a single moment of intensity. This distortion makes you believe your current state is permanent. It is not permanent. It is present. This distinction must be held firmly. Presence is temporary. Permanence is a judgment, and most judgments made during pain are unreliable if left unexamined. This is why you do not make decisions at the height of discomfort. You observe. You stabilize. You wait for clarity. You prevent pain from becoming the architect of your identity. At the same time, you do not avoid pain when action is required. Avoidance weakens character further. Instead, you move through difficulty with awareness rather than resistance. You do what must be done while refusing internal collapse. This is endurance in its highest form. Not escape, not denial, but steady engagement without surrendering reason. Each time you do this, you reinforce inner strength. Each time you collapse, you reinforce fragility. Your life is shaped by which pattern you repeat. The morning practice for this discipline begins with preparation for discomfort. Before the day unfolds, you acknowledge that difficulty may arise. You accept that pain, frustration, or pressure may appear without warning. You decide in advance that none of these will justify abandoning reason. This prevents surprise from becoming weakness. During the day when discomfort appears, you apply immediate observation. You identify what is sensation and what is interpretation. You reduce the situation to facts rather than emotional amplification. You choose response instead of reaction. You remain anchored in what is still under your control: judgment, attention, and conduct. At night, you examine where you shrank unnecessarily. You look at moments where pain influenced decisions beyond its proper role. You observe where fear of discomfort led to avoidance or hesitation. You study these moments not with guilt, but with precision, so that tomorrow your awareness becomes stronger. Over time, something important develops. You begin to notice that pain loses its authority over your identity. It remains present, but it no longer defines you. It passes through experience without reshaping character. It informs action without dictating collapse. It becomes something you endure rather than something you become. This is the core transformation. You stop interpreting pain as a command to become smaller. Instead, you treat it as a condition that requires steady reason, and in that shift, your inner life becomes independent of circumstance. Not because pain disappears, but because your response no longer submits to it. You remain intact. Number 6. Govern anger by pausing until reason speaks clearly. Anger never arrives alone. It always arrives with a story your mind creates in the same instant reality touches you. Someone speaks sharply, and immediately your mind declares you have been disrespected. A situation does not unfold as expected, and instantly your mind declares injustice. A delay appears, and your thoughts turn it into offense. In that single moment, you are no longer responding to reality. You are responding to a judgment formed without examination, and anger grows from that untested judgment like fire fed by dry material. You do not become angry because the world forces anger into you. You become angry because you accept your first interpretation without questioning it. This is where your lack of discipline reveals itself most clearly. You believe anger is strength because it feels powerful in the moment. But what you are feeling is not strength, it is loss of governance. It is the mind moving faster than reason. It is reaction replacing reflection. And every time you allow that to happen, you weaken your ability to remain stable under pressure. A disciplined mind never confuses speed with correctness. The first impulse is always loud. It demands immediate response. It says, react now. It says, defend yourself now. It says, punish now. It says, speak now. But none of these commands have been examined for truth or necessity. They are emotional reactions seeking release, not rational conclusions seeking accuracy. The gap between stimulus and response is where your freedom exists. But anger tries to collapse that gap completely. It wants instant expression. It does not want reflection because reflection threatens its dominance. If you pause, anger loses its automatic control over your behavior. This is why the pause is everything. Not a hesitation born of fear, but a deliberate interruption of impulse, so reason can enter the moment. When something provokes you, your task is not to suppress feeling and not to obey it. Your task is to withhold immediate agreement with it. You observe the rise of anger without granting it authority. You recognize it as an impression, not a command. You allow space for clarity before action. In that space, something essential happens. The emotional narrative begins to weaken. The assumption that you have been wronged begins to soften. The urgency to retaliate begins to lose force. What felt absolute begins to appear questionable, and what appeared justified begins to require evidence. Most anger survives only when it is not examined. Once examined, it becomes fragile. Ask yourself in that moment what exactly has occurred without adding interpretation. Separate fact from judgment. A person spoke, that is fact. A tone was sharp, that is fact. But disrespect, insult, attack, humiliation, injustice, these are interpretations layered on top of fact. And it is always the interpretation that fuels anger, not the event itself. If you confuse interpretation with reality, you surrender control of your mind to distortion. You must learn to recognize how quickly your mind constructs these interpretations. It happens faster than awareness. That is why discipline must precede the moment of conflict. You must train yourself daily so that when provocation arrives, the habit of pausing is already established. In the morning, before any external interaction begins, you prepare your mind for emotional disturbance. You acknowledge that situations today may trigger irritation. You accept in advance that people may act thoughtlessly, that conditions may not align with expectation, that friction may appear without warning. This preparation removes the illusion that life must behave correctly for you to remain composed. You do not prepare to avoid anger entirely, you prepare to govern it. During the day when provocation arises, you do not allow the first surge of emotion to become action. You create interruption. Even a brief pause is enough to restore reason if it is practiced consistently. In that pause, you remind yourself that your judgment is still forming and not yet complete. You do not finalize meaning immediately. You allow meaning to be tested. The person who pauses before reacting is already more powerful than the situation that provoked them, because power is not in reaction, power is in selection. You choose whether to act from impulse or from reason. You choose whether to escalate or to clarify. You choose whether to speak from emotion or from understanding. And every time you choose reason over impulse, you strengthen your ability to govern yourself. Anger thrives on identification. It tells you that you are under attack, that your dignity is threatened, that your value is being diminished. But these claims are often exaggerated or incomplete. When you believe them without examination, you defend an image of yourself rather than responding to reality. The disciplined mind does not defend images, it examines truth. Sometimes what appears as insult is misunderstanding. Sometimes what appears as disrespect is ignorance. Sometimes what appears as harm is simply difference in perception. If you respond before examining, you react to your own interpretation, not to actual intent or reality. This is how unnecessary conflict is created internally long before it appears externally. You must also recognize how anger narrows perception. In the moment of anger, your mind loses range, it forgets context, it ignores nuance, it reduces complex situations into simple narratives of offense and retaliation. This narrowing is not clarity, it is distortion, and decisions made under distortion rarely align with reason. That is why delay is not weakness, it is protection of judgment. A delayed response is a purified response. You are not denying action, you are ensuring that action is guided by understanding rather than impulse. There will be moments when anger feels justified. That is precisely when discipline matters most. Because justified anger is the most dangerous form of anger. It convinces you that reason can be bypassed because emotion feels morally correct. But feeling justified does not guarantee accuracy. It only guarantees intensity. Intensity is not truth. You must train yourself to resist the temptation of immediate moral certainty. The mind that rushes to judgment rarely sees the full picture. It sees fragments and fills gaps with assumption. And assumption, when emotionally charged, becomes conviction without evidence. Pause breaks that process. In that pause, you return to control of interpretation. You ask whether your response aligns with reason or merely satisfies emotional release. You ask whether escalation improves the situation or only expresses feeling. You ask whether silence or measured speech better preserves clarity. These questions restore governance to the rational mind. Over time, this practice reshapes your identity. You stop being a person who reacts and become a person who chooses response. Anger begins to lose its immediacy. It still arises, but it no longer governs action automatically. You notice it earlier, before it becomes behavior. You recognize its pattern, you see its distortion, and you step back into reason before damage is done. This is not emotional suppression, it is emotional governance. You are not eliminating human feeling, you are preventing feeling from becoming unexamined authority. At night, you review moments where anger appeared. You do not judge yourself harshly. You analyze structure. Where did interpretation form too quickly? Where did pause fail? Where did assumption replace observation? Where did reaction bypass reason? This reflection strengthens awareness for the next encounter. Through repetition, the gap between provocation and reaction expands. In that expanding gap, freedom grows. You begin to notice that many things that once triggered anger no longer hold power. Not because the world changed, but because your interpretation has become more precise. You are no longer easily convinced by emotional narratives. You require clarity before response. This is maturity of mind. It is the ability to remain steady when internal fire attempts to override judgment. You must understand that anger always promises strength but delivers instability. It convinces you that expression will restore control, but often expression deepens disorder. Words spoken in anger cannot be taken back. Actions taken in anger often create consequences that outlast the emotion itself. Reason delayed is protection. Reaction immediate is risk. This is why governance matters more than expression. The disciplined person is not someone who never feels anger. It is someone who never allows anger to replace reason as the governing force. Each time you pause instead of reacting, you prove to yourself that emotion is not authority. Each time you choose clarity over impulse, you reinforce rational strength. Each time you refuse immediate retaliation, you preserve dignity rather than compromise it. The world will continue to present moments that provoke anger, that will not change. What changes is whether those moments control you or become opportunities for discipline. And the moment you consistently choose pause over reaction, reason over impulse, clarity over distortion, you begin to experience something most people rarely achieve. A mind that remains intact even when provoked. A life that is not ruled by emotional reaction, but guided by deliberate judgment, and a self that cannot be easily pulled out of reason by the noise of circumstance. Number 7. Release praise and blame and hold to duty. Your mind becomes unstable the moment it begins to measure your worth through the reactions of other people. Praise lifts you too high, and blame drops you too low, and in both cases you stop standing on your own judgment. You start living as if your identity is decided outside of you, as if approval grants value and criticism removes it. This is not awareness of reality. This is surrender of self-governance. You are not suffering because people speak about you. You are suffering because you have allowed their opinions to become a substitute for your own reasoned judgment. Look closely at how often your mood depends on external evaluation. A compliment changes your confidence instantly. A criticism alters your self-image immediately. A moment of recognition makes you feel elevated. A moment of disapproval makes you feel diminished. Your inner stability moves with the opinions of others like a ship without anchor moving with every wave. And then you wonder why your mind never feels steady. You have confused social feedback with moral truth. Praise is not proof of correctness. Blame is not proof of failure. Both are opinions formed by limited perception, personal bias, and incomplete understanding. Yet you treat them as if they define the reality of your character. This is how judgment becomes outsourced. You no longer examine your actions through reason. You examine yourself through the reactions of others. And the more you depend on this external mirror, the less you trust your own rational assessment. A disciplined mind refuses this dependence entirely. It does not ignore feedback, but it does not surrender identity to it. It listens without absorption. It evaluates without emotional submission. It separates useful correction from meaningless opinion. It treats praise and blame as external events, not internal commands. The moment you allow praise to govern your behavior, you become vulnerable to manipulation. You begin acting for approval rather than for correctness. You start choosing what gains admiration instead of what aligns with reason. You slowly shift from principled action to performative action. And performative living always weakens integrity. The same mechanism applies to blame. When blame controls you, you become defensive, reactive, and internally unstable. You begin to avoid necessary action simply to escape criticism. You hesitate where clarity is required. You shrink where responsibility is needed. You adjust your behavior not according to truth, but according to fear of judgment. Both praise and blame distort action because both shift focus away from duty. Duty is what remains when all external judgments are removed. It is the action that reason identifies as correct, regardless of recognition or rejection. It is what must be done even when no one is watching, even when no one approves, even when no one understands. It is the alignment of behavior with rational integrity rather than social reaction. But most people do not operate from duty. They operate from evaluation. They ask what will people think instead of what is correct. They ask what will gain approval instead of what preserves integrity. They ask what will avoid criticism instead of what fulfills responsibility. This is how external judgment replaces internal governance. You must see how deeply this pattern has entered your decisions. How often have you chosen safety over truth simply to avoid blame? How often have you delayed action because recognition was uncertain? How often have you modified your behavior to maintain approval even when reason suggested a different path? Each instance is a small surrender of duty to perception, and each surrender weakens your inner authority. A person who lives for praise becomes fragile because praise is inconsistent. A person who fears blame becomes restricted because blame is unavoidable. But a person who lives for duty becomes stable because duty does not depend on external agreement. Duty is always available, always clear, always within reach of rational recognition. This is where freedom begins, not in being praised, not in being blamed, but in acting correctly regardless of both. To reach this state, you must first separate identity from evaluation. You are not the sum of opinions about you. You are the quality of your choices. Opinions change constantly. Choices define character. If you attach identity to opinions, you become unstable. If you attach identity to rational action, you become steady. In the morning, before external influence begins, you must prepare your mind for misjudgment by others. You acknowledge that throughout the day people may misunderstand your intentions. They may praise for the wrong reasons or criticize without understanding. You accept this in advance so that it cannot destabilize you later. Then you define your standard clearly. Today I will act according to reason. Today I will fulfill responsibility without seeking validation. Today I will not adjust my actions to gain approval or avoid blame. Today I will measure myself by duty alone. This prepares your mind for independence from external evaluation. During the day, when praise appears, you observe it without absorption. You recognize it as an external reaction, not a definition of truth. You do not inflate your identity because of it. You do not become dependent on its continuation. You simply acknowledge it and return to your task. When blame appears, you apply the same discipline. You do not collapse internally. You do not immediately assume error in identity. You examine whether the criticism contains rational substance or emotional distortion. If it contains truth, you adjust behavior. If it contains distortion, you release it without internal disruption. This selective engagement preserves clarity. The disciplined mind does not reject all judgment. It refuses uncontrolled dependence on judgment. It filters. It evaluates. It responds based on reason rather than emotional reaction. Over time, this creates a profound shift in behavior. You begin acting with greater consistency because your decisions are no longer influenced by fluctuating approval. You stop modifying your actions based on audience perception. You stop performing identity. You start living from principle. Duty becomes the center of your attention rather than reaction. And when duty becomes central, external evaluation loses its power to destabilize you. This does not mean you become indifferent to improvement. It means you stop confusing improvement with approval. You can learn from correction without needing praise. You can refine behavior without fearing blame. You can grow without emotional dependence on how growth is perceived. This is maturity of judgment. At night, you examine where external evaluation influenced your decisions unnecessarily. You identify moments where you sought approval instead of acting correctly. You observe where fear of blame limited action. You notice where praise distorted humility. This reflection is not self-judgment, but recalibration of awareness. Through repetition, something important develops. External opinions begin to lose immediate emotional impact. Praise no longer inflates you. Blame no longer deflates you. Both become informational rather than identity-defining. You begin to see them as passing judgments rather than truths about your worth. This stability is not emotional detachment from humanity. It is independence of character from social fluctuation. You remain open to feedback, but closed to dependency. You remain responsive to truth, but resistant to manipulation. You remain engaged in society, but anchored in internal reasoning. Duty becomes your anchor. And duty is not abstract. It is present in every action you take. It is speaking truthfully when silence would be easier. It is completing responsibility when avoidance would be more comfortable. It is acting fairly when bias would be convenient. It is maintaining discipline when indulgence would be easier. It is choosing reason when emotion would demand otherwise. Every moment becomes a choice between duty and reaction. Praise encourages reaction. Blame encourages reaction. But duty requires reflection. The more you align with duty, the less influence external judgment holds over your inner condition. Eventually, you notice something significant. You stop seeking validation before acting. You stop fearing criticism before deciding. You begin to act because action is correct, not because it is rewarded or protected. This creates a sense of internal steadiness that external events cannot disrupt. You are no longer living under the authority of opinions. You are living under the authority of reason, and reason does not fluctuate with praise or blame. Reason remains consistent. When this becomes your foundation, your life no longer bends according to the reactions of others. It becomes guided by internal clarity. You remain steady regardless of applause or disapproval. You act according to duty even when recognition is absent. You maintain integrity even when misunderstood, and in that state, you are no longer controlled by evaluation. You are governed by reason alone. Number 8. Choose the present task and abandon fear. Your mind does not suffer from the future. It suffers from abandoning the present while pretending to live in it. You sit in one moment but think in another, and that split is where fear grows. You are not reacting to what is in front of you. You are reacting to imagined outcomes, projected failures, and possibilities that have not yet occurred. And while your attention is scattered across what might happen, the only thing that actually requires your strength is neglected. Fear is always a displacement of attention. It pulls you away from what is real and places you inside what is uncertain. And once your mind enters uncertainty without discipline, it begins to lose structure. It starts filling gaps with assumption. It predicts harm without evidence. It rehearses failure without necessity. It treats possibility as certainty. And in that distortion, your present task disappears from awareness. You are not overwhelmed because life is too heavy. You are overwhelmed because your mind is not anchored to what is directly in front of you. Look closely at your daily behavior. You delay action because you imagine future difficulty. You hesitate because you anticipate judgment. You avoid responsibility because you picture failure before effort even begins. You abandon clarity because fear of outcome takes priority over commitment to action. In each case, you are not dealing with reality. You are dealing with mental projections that have not been tested, and yet you obey them as if they are instructions. This is how fear governs a life without being questioned. The disciplined mind refuses this obedience. It returns attention from imagined time to actual time, from projection to presence, from speculation to task, because only the present contains anything that can be acted upon. The future is not a place of action, it is a place of uncertainty, and uncertainty cannot be controlled, only interpreted. Your real work is always here, not ahead. But fear does not want you here. Fear survives by moving you away from the present moment. It says you are not ready yet. It says conditions are not right yet. It says you should wait until certainty appears. It says you must avoid risk until guarantees are given. But certainty never arrives in advance. It only exists after action has already taken place. So fear keeps you suspended in hesitation, where nothing is built and nothing is faced. You must see how costly this hesitation becomes. A task remains unfinished, not because it is impossible, but because fear interrupts initiation. A conversation remains unspoken, not because truth is unclear, but because fear imagines reaction. A decision remains delayed, not because understanding is lacking, but because fear exaggerates consequence. The present moment keeps offering itself for action, but fear keeps redirecting attention elsewhere. This is not caution. This is avoidance disguised as thinking, and avoidance always increases internal pressure. What is not faced does not disappear. It accumulates. It grows heavier in imagination than it would ever be in reality. The mind begins to experience the weight of everything it refuses to confront. This creates exhaustion without progress, tension without action, and anxiety without resolution. The solution is not to eliminate fear. The solution is to refuse its authority over attention. You do this by returning to the present task, without negotiation, not the imagined task, not the feared outcome, not the projected scenario. The actual task in front of you right now. When you are working, you work. When you are speaking, you speak. When you are deciding, you decide. When you are learning, you learn. When you are solving, you solve. The mind is not allowed to wander into speculative territory while action is required in reality. This discipline appears simple, yet it is the foundation of inner stability. Because fear grows strongest when attention is divided. When you are physically present but mentally absent, fear fills the gap. When attention is unified in the present task, fear loses space to expand. It cannot dominate what is fully engaged. This is why your relationship with fear is not primarily emotional. It is attentional. Where your attention goes, your experience follows. You must train yourself to notice the first movement of fear as it arises. It always begins subtly, a slight hesitation, a quiet thought of doubt, a mental image of failure, a prediction of difficulty. If you do not interrupt it there, it develops into avoidance. If you interrupt it early, it remains powerless. This interruption is not suppression, it is redirection. You do not argue with fear. You do not amplify it through internal debate. You simply return attention to the task that is real. Fear exists in abstraction. Action exists in reality. You cannot solve abstraction with more abstraction. You dissolve it by returning to what is concrete. The present task is always concrete. It has shape, requirement, and direction. It asks nothing of imagination. It only asks engagement. In the morning, before the day begins, you must prepare your mind for this discipline. You acknowledge that fear will attempt to pull attention away from action. You accept that uncertainty will appear in different forms throughout the day. You remind yourself that none of these internal movements determine your conduct unless you allow them to. You decide in advance that fear will not select your priorities. Only reason will determine what is done, and only the present task will receive full attention. During the day, you practice immediate return. When fear appears, you do not follow its narrative. You notice it and return to what is in front of you. If fear says you might fail, you return to the steps required for execution. If fear says you might be judged, you return to the responsibility that must be completed. If fear says you are not ready, you return to the fact that readiness is built through action, not waiting. Fear always speaks about outcomes. Reason always speaks about action. You choose action. This repeated return builds mental strength not through elimination of fear, but through non-compliance with it. Over time, fear becomes less persuasive because it no longer leads behavior. It still appears, but it no longer redirects your life. You also begin to notice a deeper truth. Most fear is not rooted in actual danger but in imagined evaluation. Fear of failure is often fear of judgment. Fear of loss is often fear of identity disruption. Fear of difficulty is often fear of discomfort. Once you see these layers clearly, fear loses much of its authority. It becomes a signal, not a command, a signal to return to the present, not a directive to withdraw from it. At night, you examine where fear disrupted presence. You identify moments where attention left the task prematurely. You observe where imagined outcomes replaced real action. You study where hesitation delayed necessary movement. This reflection strengthens awareness so that next time fear appears, recognition happens sooner. Through this training, something fundamental shifts. You begin to experience continuity of action. Tasks are no longer fragmented by hesitation. Attention no longer collapses into projection. You remain with what you are doing rather than abandoning it for what you fear. This creates efficiency, but more importantly, it creates stability. A stable mind is not one without fear. It is one that does not abandon presence because of fear. And presence is where all real power exists. Because only in the present can judgment be corrected, effort be applied, and character be expressed. Fear removes you from that space. Discipline returns you to it. You must understand this clearly. You will never eliminate uncertainty from life. You will never secure absolute guarantees. You will never remove the possibility of difficulty. But none of these conditions prevent you from acting rightly in the present moment. And acting rightly in the present moment is the only control you ever truly possess. So the discipline is simple in structure but demanding in execution. When fear arises, you return to the present task. When imagination pulls you forward into uncertainty, you return to action. When hesitation appears, you move into engagement. When doubt speaks, you let reason select behavior, not prediction. In this way, fear becomes background noise rather than governing force, and your life becomes defined not by what you imagine might happen, but by what you choose to do now. The present task remains, fear passes, and reason continues its work without interruption. Number 9. Practice virtue daily until nothing shakes your mind. You keep searching for stability in outcomes while ignoring the only place stability can ever be built. Your mind treats life as something that must become calm before you can act calmly. It treats circumstances as the source of disturbance instead of revealing the state of your own judgment. But nothing outside you governs your inner collapse. What shakes you is never the event alone. It is the absence of practiced virtue in the moment the event arrives. Virtue is not a belief you hold. It is a discipline you practice until it becomes your natural response to everything life presents. Every disturbance you experience reveals a gap in practice, not a flaw in reality. When you become angry, it is because justice was not applied inwardly before reaction outwardly. When you become fearful, it is because courage was not exercised in the moment perception appeared. When you become greedy, it is because self-control was not present at the point of desire. When you become judgmental, it is because clarity was not applied before assumption took over. Your instability is not random. It is the predictable result of untrained responses. You are not shaken by life. You are shaken by your lack of practiced virtue in real time. Most people think virtue is something they understand intellectually. They can define honesty, patience, courage, and discipline in words. But the mind does not change through definition. It changes through repetition of correct action under pressure. Until virtue is practiced repeatedly in moments of discomfort, it remains theory, and theory collapses when reality applies pressure. This is why your emotional life feels inconsistent. You have knowledge without training. You have ideas without embodiment. You have understanding without repetition. So when life tests you, the mind defaults to habit, not principle, and habit is usually reactive. The Stoic life is not built on occasional good intentions. It is built on continuous correction of behavior in small daily moments. Virtue is not reserved for major crises. It is practiced in ordinary situations where nobody is watching and nothing dramatic is happening. It is in those moments that the structure of your character is formed. You must begin to see every moment as a training ground for judgment. A delay is not just inconvenience, it is an opportunity to practice patience. A disagreement is not just conflict, it is an opportunity to practice fairness. A temptation is not just desire, it is an opportunity to practice self-control. A setback is not just frustration, it is an opportunity to practice resilience. If you fail to see this, you experience life passively. If you see this, you begin to shape yourself actively. Nothing shakes a mind that has trained itself to respond with virtue before reaction. But you must understand the real difficulty. The mind resists consistent practice because it prefers immediate relief over long-term stability. It prefers emotional expression over disciplined response. It prefers comfort over correctness. So when pressure appears, the mind tries to abandon principle in exchange for temporary ease. This is where most people lose control of themselves. They know what is right, but do not do it when it matters. That gap between knowing and doing is where instability lives. To close that gap, you must train repetition. Not occasional effort, but daily correction of behavior aligned with reason. Each time you act in accordance with virtue despite discomfort, you strengthen inner structure. Each time you abandon virtue for impulse, you weaken it. Your character is not defined by what you understand. It is defined by what you repeatedly practice under real conditions. This is why mornings matter. Before the day begins, you must align your mind with standards that are not dependent on mood. You decide in advance that honesty will guide speech regardless of convenience. You decide that patience will guide reaction regardless of frustration. You decide that discipline will guide action regardless of desire. You establish that reason, not impulse, will govern behavior. This preparation is not symbolic, it is structural. It creates a reference point for the mind when pressure appears later. During the day, virtue must be applied in real time, not after reflection. When anger rises, you do not wait to cool down before recognizing it. You recognize it immediately and apply restraint. When desire appears, you do not negotiate with it. You evaluate it against reason. When fear enters, you do not follow it. You examine whether it reflects reality or imagination. Each moment becomes a test of whether virtue is active or absent. There is no neutral state. Either virtue is being practiced or impulse is governing behavior. This is why awareness must be continuous. The mind is always moving toward reaction unless guided toward discipline. Without attention, old patterns take over automatically. That is why self-mastery is not achieved once. It is maintained repeatedly. You must also remove the idea that virtue depends on external conditions. You do not practice courage only when things are safe. You do not practice patience only when things are easy. You do not practice fairness only when it benefits you. Virtue is tested precisely when conditions are uncomfortable. That is its purpose. Without difficulty, there is no demonstration of strength. A calm life does not create virtue. A tested life reveals it. This understanding changes how you interpret hardship. You no longer see difficulty as interruption. You see it as exposure. It reveals whether your principles are real or only verbal. It shows you whether your reasoning holds under pressure or collapses under discomfort. Every challenge becomes feedback about the state of your inner discipline. When you respond poorly, you do not condemn yourself. You correct the pattern. You identify where judgment failed. You observe where impulse replaced reason. You adjust for next time. This is how progress is built quietly and consistently. The goal is not perfection. The goal is stability under pressure. As practice deepens, something subtle begins to change. External events lose their ability to create immediate emotional chaos. You still feel discomfort, but it no longer dictates behavior. You still experience frustration, but it no longer defines action. You still encounter difficulty, but it no longer destabilizes judgment. The mind begins to maintain structure even in disturbance. This is the sign that virtue is becoming habitual. At night, reflection becomes essential. You examine where virtue was present and where it was absent. You do not focus on outcome, but on quality of response. Where did patience hold? Where did anger override reason? Where did clarity remain intact? Where did impulse take control? This examination sharpens awareness for the next cycle of action. Through repetition, the gap between awareness and behavior narrows. Eventually, you begin to notice earlier when you are about to lose discipline. You catch impulses before they become action. You recognize emotional distortions before they become decisions. You interrupt patterns before they fully form. This is the development of inner sensitivity guided by reason rather than emotion. A mind trained in virtue becomes difficult to destabilize because it is no longer reactive by default. It responds from principle rather than from impulse. It does not depend on ideal conditions to remain stable. It maintains structure within imperfect conditions. This is what it means for nothing to shake your mind. Not that external events disappear, not that difficulty ceases, but that your response no longer collapses under them. Stability is no longer borrowed from circumstance. It is generated from within through practiced discipline. You must understand that this is built slowly, not through dramatic transformation, but through repeated alignment of action with principle. Every small moment matters. Every response either strengthens or weakens your foundation. There is no invisible accumulation. The mind records every instance of discipline and every instance of surrender, so you must choose carefully, repeatedly, and consciously, because over time, what you practice becomes what you are. And when virtue becomes the default structure of your behavior, life no longer has the power to shake you easily. Not because life changes, but because you have been trained to remain steady within it. Number 10. Remember death each morning and live without waste. You keep behaving as if time is guaranteed to you, as if tomorrow is already secured, as if the continuation of your life is something owed rather than something merely possible. And in that quiet assumption you waste the only reality that is ever truly yours. Not because you are careless in intention, but because you are absent in awareness. You move through hours as if they are abundant, yet you never actually stand inside them fully. Death is not a distant philosophical idea. It is the constant boundary that defines the seriousness of every moment you ignore. When you forget this, your mind becomes permissive. It allows delay without consequence. It tolerates distraction without correction. It accepts avoidance without urgency. You begin to treat your time as something flexible, something expandable, something that will always be available later. But nothing in your experience confirms that assumption. Only habit sustains it. Each morning you wake without certainty that there will be another morning, yet you behave as if this fact is irrelevant. You open your day with thoughts of postponement, unnecessary hesitation, and scattered attention. You give energy to trivial matters while postponing what requires clarity. You indulge emotional noise while delaying disciplined action, and all of it happens under the illusion that there will be more time to correct course later. This illusion is the root of wasted life. Remembering death is not morbidity. It is clarity stripped of deception. It removes the softness from excuses. It removes the comfort from procrastination. It removes the illusion that time is elastic. When you truly recognize that your life is not infinite in experience, urgency is no longer forced. It becomes natural. You stop negotiating with distraction when you realize every moment is non-replicable. The mind that remembers death each morning does not drift easily into waste. It does not postpone essential action for comfort. It does not treat discipline as optional. It does not wait for perfect conditions before beginning what must be done. It understands that waiting itself is already consumption of limited time. But your undisciplined mind resists this awareness. It avoids it by filling the day with noise. It distracts itself with endless small engagements that feel productive but carry no lasting meaning. It seeks comfort in repetition rather than clarity in action. And in doing so, it slowly replaces living with passing time. You are not short of time. You are short of attention applied with awareness of its value. When you forget mortality, you treat moments lightly. When you remember mortality, you treat moments precisely. Every action becomes weighted. Every decision becomes deliberate. Every hour becomes something that cannot be recovered if misused. This is not pressure imposed externally. It is recognition of reality as it already is. The Stoic discipline begins each morning with this recognition, not as fear, but as orientation. You do not know how many mornings remain. You only know that this morning is present, and presence demands responsibility. You do not postpone alignment with reason. You begin with it immediately because delay itself is already loss. You examine your first thoughts of the day. You observe where your mind tries to drift into avoidance. You notice where comfort seeks priority over clarity. you see how quickly the mind wants to escape effort by imagining later opportunities, and you interrupt this pattern before it governs your direction. The awareness of mortality removes negotiation from discipline. You stop asking whether you feel like acting and start asking whether action is necessary. You stop asking whether conditions are favorable and start asking whether the moment requires response. You stop measuring effort against comfort and start measuring it against meaning, because meaning only exists in what is actually done, not what is delayed. Throughout the day, distraction will attempt to reclaim your attention. It will present itself as urgency, entertainment, conversation, or avoidance disguised as necessity. But when you remember that time is not renewable, these distractions lose authority. They become visible as consumption rather than enrichment. You begin to notice how often you exchange meaningful action for temporary stimulation. You see how frequently you choose ease over responsibility. You observe how easily your attention is pulled away from what matters into what merely passes time. And in that observation, a shift begins. You no longer trust automatic behavior. You begin to question whether each action contributes to a life that would remain meaningful if it ended today. This question is not dramatic. It is clarifying. It strips away unnecessary activity. It reveals where energy is being spent without alignment to purpose. It exposes where time is being traded for nothing of value. The mind that lives with awareness of death does not become anxious. It becomes precise. Precision replaces wandering. Focus replaces scattering. Intention replaces impulse. You no longer allow entire hours to dissolve into unconscious habit. You begin to reclaim them through awareness, but this requires consistent practice. Because the mind forgets quickly, it returns to comfort even after insight. It slips back into delay even after realization. That is why daily remembrance is necessary, not as ritual, but as correction. Each morning, you remind yourself that this day is not guaranteed to repeat, not to induce fear, but to sharpen attention. You acknowledge that what you do with this day determines whether it is lived or merely passed through. You establish that no moment will be treated as disposable. During the day, when hesitation appears, you return to this awareness. You recognize hesitation as hidden waste. You see delay not as harmless pause, but as quiet erosion of opportunity. You act not from pressure, but from clarity that time is active, not passive. It is being used or it is being lost. There is no neutral state. At night, you examine where the day was spent without awareness. You identify moments that were consumed by distraction. You observe where avoidance replaced action. You notice where attention was surrendered without necessity. This reflection is not regret. It is calibration. It restores awareness for the next cycle. Over time, something fundamental changes in your experience of life. Time no longer feels vague or endless. It becomes immediate and structured. You begin to feel the weight of each hour without anxiety. You become more deliberate without becoming tense. You act more efficiently without becoming hurried. You remain calm because clarity replaces illusion. You start to understand that waste is not always visible. It is often internal. It is the unchosen thought that lingers too long. It is the unnecessary reaction that consumes attention. It is the delayed action that never recovers momentum. It is the habitual distraction that fragments focus. All of these are forms of life slipping away unnoticed, and once seen clearly, they cannot be ignored. This awareness changes your standards. You no longer accept shallow engagement with your own time. You no longer tolerate prolonged distraction without correction. You no longer justify avoidance as harmless delay. You begin to measure your day not by activity but by alignment with what is necessary. And necessity becomes defined by reason, not impulse. Reason tells you what must be done now. Impulse tells you to postpone. Reason brings focus to the present task. Impulse disperses attention across imagined futures. Reason preserves integrity of time. Impulse dissolves it into fragments. You choose reason, not once but repeatedly, until it becomes the structure of your life. In this state, you begin to notice something quietly powerful. Life feels more complete, even though nothing external has necessarily increased. The difference is not in quantity of experience, but in quality of attention. You are no longer partially present. You are engaged fully with what is real. This is how waste disappears, not by adding more time, but by removing absence within time. And when absence is removed, every moment becomes used as it should be, deliberately, clearly, and without unnecessary delay. You do not control the length of your life, but you do control whether the life you have is lived with awareness or lost to distraction. And in that control lies the only form of freedom that matters. To remember death is to remember urgency without panic. To live without waste is to act without delay. And to act without delay is to finally treat your life as something that is happening now, not something endlessly postponed.